Hello, and welcome to our lightning talk today. Today, our lightning talk is titled Beyond CC BY Using ND for Harm Reduction and Intentionality. It is presented by both myself, Haley Norris. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Open Education Librarian from Indiana University, Bloomington, and my co-presenter.
Greetings, I am Stephen Krueger, pronouns AM or he, him. I am the Affordable Course Content Librarian at the University of Kentucky. So the first section of our talk is going to consist of three probably seemingly unconnected examples. Um, these are different types of material that someone might publish and our experiences with them. And in the second half of the talk, we will bring them together. Uh, so I am first going to talk about my experiences publishing as an author and an editor on the topic of gender diversity. So a few years ago, I was working with a potential book publisher, and one of the elements in our contract negotiations uh, involved asking the publisher to give the editors full control over whether someone made a translation of our book. Um, this was because on the topic of gender diversity, the way in which different languages and different cultures, the terminology and the concepts used vary wildly. So in order to make an accurate and appropriate translation, we would not only need a translator to be obviously familiar with their own language, but familiar with how gender diversity is described in that language. Um, so that experience made me think a lot more carefully about the things that I want someone making an adaptation of works on this topic, whether it's a direct translation or whether it's a more flexible adaptation like you might do with OER. Um, I want an adapter to possess an understanding of how to respectfully discuss the personal experiences that might be shared in the original around gender identity. I also want them to be familiar with current terminology in whatever language they're using, whether that's the original language or not. And like I talked about, familiarity with the language in translation. So these are all things I think about specifically on this topic when considering who I might want to adapt and how. And these are all conversations I would want to have with the potential adapter.
Yes, and our second example of a type of publication is an Indigenous knowledge work. So, as an Indigenous Latina and OER facilitator myself, I'm constantly aware of where knowledge comes from and who has created it. Indigenous knowledge differs from traditional open resources for the need for respect and sincerity, and involved in sharing it widely. Because unfortunately, historically, these knowledge networks has been erased, ignored, and appropriated. Thus, the urgency for finding a pathway for reciprocity and respect. Making adaptations of knowledge works requires a communication pathway between authors and editors, which is something that is really important, not only for the Indigenous knowledge sovereignty aspect, but also for sharing that knowledge and providing pathways forward for people to share and use it.
Our third example is squarely within the realm of OER. Um, Recently, in talking with an author who was funded through my OER grant program about the license that she wants to use for her book, um, she informed me, to summarize, I don't remember the exact words, that but she did use the word fascist here, that she wanted to use an ND license because she was concerned that someone would make a fascist adaptation of her work. Um, as I think a lot of us in this field are familiar with because it's gotten a lot of attention. This is not a theoretical fear. This is something that is actually happening with published OER in real life. Most notoriously, as it made it into Inside Higher Ed, an open textbook on sociology being censored and sanitized to remove materials that Florida has deemed unacceptable to teach. This, under the terms of a CC BY license, is a perfectly legal use of that license and that work. And this is the kind of thing that my author is trying to protect against. And it's certainly something I'm not going to require her to not use an ND license. I want her to have the protections that she wants for her work. So we are now going to bring together some recurring themes and practical implications of the examples that we just discussed.
Yes. So the 5 R's of OER is a definition that's used widely in our field. However, our examples given contradict and challenge this definition, specifically the revised portion. Many OER repositories and also a majority opinion among open educators lend to non-derivative license works being excluded from the OER label and use despite these materials being both open and educational resources. The communities impacted by needing to safeguard their knowledge need a pathway into OER without endangering their work and identities. This will lead us next into our reoccurring themes that we've seen throughout our examples and our experience.
There's some pretty clear commonalities, despite these being very different examples coming from different contexts and different types of authorship. Um, in all of these cases, um, authors and editors are have concerns about the potential for adaptations that disrespect the original material. Um, I think it's really important to note that these abuses may be out of bigotry, either at a state level or an individual adapter level, um, or they can be extremely well intended but done out of ignorance. I don't think this is one of those cases where that really common guideline to assume good intent is honestly that relevant because that does not mean that does not erase the need for specialized knowledge in order to handle information well. Um, Another thread here is that there's a very common, sometimes unspoken, sometimes explicitly stated assumption in the field of open ed that um, everyone should have a right to adapt works. Like Haley just talked about, the right to revise a work is considered one of the fundamental elements of the most commonly used definition of OER. Um, and materials with an ND license are not considered OER by that definition. There's the implication, or again, sometimes outright stated opinion that more open licenses are morally good, inherently good in some way. Um, we don't have time to really dig into that here, but I thought that was worth naming. Um, and the other recurring theme in all of the ones that we talked about is the potential or reality of authors opting out of publishing OER by this definition, which is, is perpetuated and imposed by what's allowed to be in a repository and what is considered OER, to protect their works from these risks. Haley, any thoughts on the recurring themes before we get into the practical implications?
Yes, thank you. With these reoccurring themes, we do also can't get into it too much because this is a lightning talk, but academia itself has a problem with assumed ownership of materials, of work, of labor, and that does lead us into our practical applications. So if we take a look at our practical applications, we've identified 4 areas that directly impact our examples given and our own experience. So we'll talk first about limited visibility. So works with indie licenses may be blocked from OER repositories since they don't fall under the traditional definition of being able to edit it at will. They're often excluded from these, which leads us to our third point, which is the exclusion. So we have materials, whether that's indigenous knowledge or gender diversity materials, that need to be safeguarded and protected for these communities and these authors. However, now they're being excluded from and not qualified as OER because we are uh, authors aren't allowing that blanket revision, despite the fact that ND licenses doesn't mean that someone can't revise it. It just means they need to have a conversation. So that leads us into the lack of connection, which is our fourth point. So potential adapters, potential editors, they don't communicate with those original authors, which the more communication that we create and encouraging that communication leads to and can lead to the lack of that assumed ownership, um, which is an ongoing problem, again, that we have in academia. And reeling back to our second point of outdated practices, practices are always having to update and adapt to what's currently going on with our current like political standing and with our current state of different state legislators, we will have OER professionals that will have to edit works based on what's allowed in their areas and what's allowed legally in their states. So allowing our authors to have those indie licenses can prevent a lot of their information from being destroyed or erased or adapted into less desirable adaptations, such as fascist or tyrannical adaptations of those works. Here. And beyond our practical applications, Stephen, do you have any additions to this?
Just highlighting the connection point that you talked about. Um, when I work with an author who wants to apply an ND license, or honestly, even if they don't, if they want to even include the blanket permission to adapt, I encourage them to include information in their introduction, letting potential adapters know how like what approaches that can be used. Either encouraging people just, hey, if you make an adaptation, let me know, blanket permission, go for it. Um, because often people don't get told when an adaptation is made or when people are using their works. Or if someone is putting an ND license, like you said, ND doesn't mean I don't want anyone to translate this work or make another adaptation. It means I want to give permission on a case by case basis after communicating with the person. So I have some template language that I let authors adapt if they publish with me, where they provide contact information if they're open to that. So they can say, I encourage adaptations in various ways or whatever they want to say. They just need to be communicated with directly first, which I argue actually adds an additional layer of opening up how this publishing works rather than like encouraging communication and collaboration rather than having someone just make sure they're checking a box and have a license they're used. Um, because this is the lightning talk, we do need to conclude, regardless of how much else we have to say on this topic. Um, so our goal here is not to demand a new definition of OER that is as strict as anyone that previously existed. I think that's what got us here. Um, our goal is to encourage the field to reflect on whether the 5 hours definition is serving us well, given all the time that has passed and knowing how much more we know about how these materials are used and can be used, and how things have changed in the US politically really significantly in the meantime. And maybe the answer is yes, we are sticking with that definition. We think the required blanket permission to adapt is fundamental to what OER means. I'm just asking that that be an intentional decision that we reach as a field rather than one that we just haven't considered the implications of. Haley, any last thoughts before we wrap up?
I no last thoughts for now. My only conclusion would be on our thank you slide. Not only thank you for listening to our lightning talk today, but also if you are have some time to look at additional resources, please take a look at the 6 R's of Indigenous OER linked on that thank you page. Something that differs from the 6 R's of Indigenous OER and our 5 R's of OER is the Indigenous OER 6 R's does include respect and reverence and reciprocity. So it does create more of a communication network, which is something that we'd like to explore or something that we'd like to encourage among the open ed field.
Thank you for your time.